Tonight we're going to talk about one of the most misunderstood, gloriously grimy, and surprisingly complicated chapters in human history. The everyday reality of medieval peasants and why they earned their remarkable reputation for smelling exactly the way they did. So, before you get comfortable, take a moment, like the video, and subscribe. But only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here, and let me know in the comments where you're tuning in from and what time it is for you. It's always fascinating to see who's joining us from around the world. Now, dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. Imagine waking up in a small medieval cottage somewhere around the year 1250. The rooster outside is already screaming at the sun for existing. Your bed, if you can generously call it that, is a lumpy sack of straw shared with 2 siblings, 1 uncle, and possibly a chicken that wandered in during the night and refused to leave. You open your eyes slowly. Something itches. Actually, several things itch. You have been asleep for perhaps 6 hours, and in that time the small ecosystem living inside your straw mattress has been very busy indeed. Fleas have hosted a banquet, lice have organised a small parade. Somewhere near your left elbow, a bedbug is quietly filing a complaint about your choice of soap. Good morning. Welcome to another glorious day in medieval peasant life. Now, before we go any further tonight, we need to gently retire one of history's most enduring myths. The popular idea that medieval peasants were completely filthy creatures who never washed, never bathed, and considered soap a suspicious foreign invention brought back by weary travellers from the East. That cartoon image, as entertaining as it is, does not entirely match what historians have actually discovered. Medieval peasants were dirtier than modern people. Yes, their standards of cleanliness were different, absolutely, but they were not walking through life inside a permanent cloud of grime while chewing on turnips and swatting at flies. The truth, as it usually turns out, is far more interesting, far more human, and occasionally far more entertaining than the cartoon version. Buckle in. This is going to get a little unpleasant, and quite a bit funnier than you might expect. Let us start with something basic. Water, modern life, has spoiled us in ways we rarely appreciate. You wake up, walk to a small metal handle, twist it, and clean water simply appears whenever you want it. Cold water, hot water, sparkling water, water that has travelled hundreds of miles through pipes just to fill your glass. Medieval peasants did not enjoy this particular luxury. If you wanted water, you fetched it, and fetching it meant walking, sometimes considerable distances, to a well, a stream, or the nearest village pond. You then carried it back in heavy wooden buckets, spilling generously along the way, and by the time you returned home, your shoulders were already convinced that today would be an excellent day to reconsider your life choices. Now imagine doing this several times each day before you have accomplished anything else. Suddenly, taking a nice long bath every evening starts sounding less like basic hygiene and more like a serious logistical undertaking, because that is exactly what it was. Heating enough water to fill a proper bathtub required an enormous amount of firewood, which itself required chopping, hauling and storing. It required time you did not have and fuel your family probably could not spare. So the average peasant did not soak in a hot tub every evening while quietly meditating on the day's events. They washed differently. Faces, hands, arms, feet, all rinsed regularly throughout the day, especially before meals and after work. A basin of cool water sat in most cottages, refreshed daily, and used for the small everyday washing that kept ordinary grime under control. Full-body bathing happened less often, but it happened. Usually in warmer months, usually in a stream or river when the weather cooperated, and usually with far more social company than modern people would find comfortable. Privacy, like clean water, was another modern luxury that peasants simply did not possess in abundance. Interestingly enough, medieval towns often had public bathhouses. These were not the sort of grim, mysterious places later stereotypes have made them out to be. They were popular, they were surprisingly common, and in some cities you could visit one for a very modest fee. bathers soaked in wooden tubs of warm water, sometimes scented with herbs, and enjoyed the kind of communal relaxation that would look strangely familiar to anyone who has visited a modern spa. Peasants living near towns occasionally treated themselves to a proper bath at such a house, especially before important festivals, weddings, or religious holidays. Bathing before Easter was practically a tradition. Cleanliness, it turned out, was very much part of medieval life. It simply required more effort than turning a knob and waiting for hot water to arrive. Effort, unfortunately, was the one currency medieval peasants already spent generously every single day of their lives. Now, here comes the part that modern people find genuinely difficult to imagine. Even with regular washing, medieval peasants absolutely did smell. Not because they refused to clean themselves, because everything around them smelled equally strongly. Their clothing was made from wool and linen, materials that hold odour for months and cannot be tossed into a washing machine on a Sunday afternoon. Wool especially was rarely washed properly because doing so risked ruining the fabric. Instead, garments were brushed, aired outside, and occasionally rinsed. A peasant might own 2 sets of clothes total, perhaps 3 if they were doing rather well for themselves. That single wool tunic accompanied them through months of harvesting, hauling firewood, cleaning stables, cooking beside smoky fires, and sweating through summers that offered no air conditioning and very little sympathy. By the time winter arrived, that tunic had a personality of its own. Then there was the small matter of livestock. Peasants did not simply live near their animals. They often lived with them. In colder months, chickens, goats, pigs, and even a family cow might share the ground floor of the cottage, contributing warmth in exchange for shelter. This arrangement was practical, economical, and absolutely devastating to the indoor atmosphere. Modern people struggle to imagine what it smells like to share a single-room house with a cow that has been eating cabbage for 3 days. Medieval peasants did not have to imagine. They knew intimately. And after long enough, they simply stopped noticing. That, incidentally, is one of the strangest tricks the human nose ever performs. Prolonged exposure to any smell, no matter how impressive, eventually becomes background noise. Your neighbours might smell like a barnyard. You might smell like a barnyard. Everyone in the entire village might smell like a barnyard. But if everyone smells the same, nobody complains, because complaining about the air is like complaining about the weather. It exists. It is loud. And nobody has invented a solution yet. Now let us talk about the ground itself, because the environment played an enormous role in medieval hygiene. Villages were built on packed earth, mud and dust. Streets, if they even qualified as streets, were often little more than trampled paths that turned into rivers of sludge whenever rain arrived. Household waste, food scraps, animal manure, ashes, and the occasional broken pot all found their way into the streets, where pigs happily wandered through them, cleaning up dinner scraps like enthusiastic 4-legged garbage collectors. Rain washed some of it away eventually. Sun baked the rest into an aromatic crust. You, meanwhile, walked through this landscape wearing leather shoes that had never encountered polish, splashing through puddles whose contents nobody in their right mind would investigate. By the time you returned home, your feet, your hem, your knees, and quite possibly your dignity, had all been introduced to substances the modern world has thankfully forgotten how to produce. Yet, and this is the part that always surprises people, medieval peasants genuinely valued cleanliness. Not modern surgical cleanliness, of course. That kind of sparkling perfection was not physically possible in a world without indoor plumbing, refrigeration, or industrial detergents. But peasants noticed dirt. They complained about it. They mocked those who seemed excessively grubby, and church sermons routinely praised cleanliness as a virtue closely tied to spiritual purity. Being clean, in the medieval mind, was not simply about smelling nice. It was about respecting yourself, your neighbours, and God. A peasant who arrived at church covered in mud and smelling like a stable was gently reminded, sometimes not so gently. That Sunday morning was not the moment for that particular fashion statement. There were expectations. There were standards. They were simply different standards than the ones you and I quietly enforce today whenever we sniff our shirt before deciding whether it can survive one more day of use. Perhaps the most fascinating detail of all is how peasants thought about bathing itself. Some medieval physicians, particularly during certain outbreaks of plague, actually advised against frequent bathing. They believed hot water opened the pores of the skin, allowing dangerous vapours to enter the body. This was, of course, entirely wrong. But it was based on the medical theories of the day, and people took it seriously because the alternative, catching a mysterious disease that killed half the village, was considerably more frightening than a slightly aromatic tunic. In some regions, bathing habits genuinely declined during the worst plague years. In others, they continued exactly as before. Medieval Europe, contrary to popular belief, was not one single culture with one single opinion. It was a patchwork of villages, regions, kingdoms, and traditions, and the truth about how often people washed depended almost entirely on where they lived, when they lived, and how much water they were willing to carry uphill on a Tuesday morning. By the time our imaginary peasant has finished their morning chores, fetched water, splashed their face, brushed dust from yesterday's tunic, and stepped outside to feed the pigs, the sun is barely past the horizon. Already they have interacted with more dirt, sweat, animal hair, and everyday grime than most modern people encounter in an entire week. And this, remember, is only the beginning of the day. There are still fields to work, meals to prepare, livestock to tend, floors to sweep, and 100 other tasks waiting patiently, none of which will help anyone smell like fresh lavender. As you'll soon discover throughout the rest of this journey, the story of medieval hygiene is not the story of people who did not care about cleanliness. It is the story of people who cared enormously and were fighting a losing battle against a world that was simply dirtier than any human bathwater could ever hope to fix. If you ever want to understand just how differently medieval peasants lived, forget about castles and knights for a moment, and instead take a long, serious look at their laundry. Because laundry, believe it or not, was one of the great unspoken battles of daily life. And it is a battle that reveals more about medieval hygiene than almost any other detail. Today, doing the laundry means walking a few steps to a machine, pressing a button, and returning an hour later to fold warm, fluffy garments that smell suspiciously like a mountain meadow that has never actually existed. Medieval peasants would have found this concept absolutely magical. They would have also found it deeply unfair, because their version of laundry involved an entire day of exhausting physical labour, and the result almost never smelled like a mountain meadow. It usually smelled like whatever the last river had to offer. Let us begin with the fabric itself. Peasant clothing was made overwhelmingly from two materials, wool and linen. Wool came from sheep, which every village had in generous supply. Linen came from flax, which peasants often grew themselves in small plots beside their cottages. Both fabrics were durable, both were practical, and both had one enormous problem. They did not enjoy being washed. Wool especially was a temperamental creature. Submerge it in hot water, scrub it enthusiastically, and you would return to find your favourite tunic had mysteriously shrunk to the size of a garment suitable for a small dog. Peasants learned this lesson quickly, and after ruining one or two precious pieces of clothing, they generally decided that wool garments would be cleaned differently. Not less often, necessarily, just differently. Brushing, airing, spot cleaning, and occasional careful rinsing became the standard treatment for anything made of wool, which unfortunately included most winter clothing. Linen was more forgiving. Linen could be washed, linen could be scrubbed, linen could even be beaten against rocks, which is exactly what many peasants did whenever they finally found the time and the water to give it a proper cleaning. And this is where medieval laundry became a genuinely social event. In warmer months, groups of village women would gather at the local river or stream, carrying baskets stuffed with dirty linens, and spend hours washing together. They soaked the fabric, rubbed it with whatever cleaning agent they had available, beat it against smooth flat stones, and then rinsed it in the flowing water. The process was loud, wet, and exhausting. It was also, if we are being honest, one of the highlights of the week, because while they scrubbed, they gossiped. And medieval village gossip was every bit as entertaining as the modern equivalent. Who had been seen sneaking home after curfew, who had argued with whose mother-in-law, whose bread had failed to rise for the third time in a row. Laundry day was not simply about cleaning shirts. It was about maintaining the entire social fabric of the village, while cleaning the actual fabric of the village. Now about that cleaning agent. Medieval peasants did have soap, but not the sweet-smelling, artfully packaged bars that fill modern shelves. Their soap was harsh, unglamorous, and produced through a process that involved animal fat, wood ash, and considerable patience. Wood ash, when soaked in water, produced a strong alkaline solution called lye. Combined with fat, this lye eventually transformed into a rough, greasy substance that could genuinely clean cloth and skin. It was effective. It was also unpleasant. Good soap stung the eyes, irritated the hands, and possessed a fragrance that could most charitably be described as agricultural. Wealthier households sometimes purchased finer soap from towns, occasionally scented with herbs or flowers, but such luxuries rarely appeared in the average peasant home. For most families, homemade lye soap was the everyday cleaner, and everyone made peace with its aggressive personality. There were alternatives, of course. In many regions, peasants used stale urine as a laundry aid. Yes, you heard that correctly, and no, I am not exaggerating. Aged urine contains ammonia, which is a genuinely effective cleaning agent, and medieval washers knew this long before any chemist wrote it down in a textbook. Collected urine was allowed to sit, ferment and develop its full cleaning potential, then added to the wash water. Modern noses would object strongly to this technique. Medieval noses had already accepted worse. The clothes came out cleaner, brighter, and free of many stains that plain water could not defeat, which was really the only measurement that mattered. What was slightly startling to modern sensibilities was, to medieval peasants, simply practical chemistry that happened to arrive free of charge. Once the laundry was scrubbed, beaten and rinsed, the next challenge appeared immediately. Drying, in a world without dryers, drying racks, or reliable indoor heating, damp clothing became a serious logistical problem. In warm, sunny weather, peasants spread wet linens across bushes, hedges, low walls, and any flat surface the sunshine could reach. Rows of shirts, sheets, and undergarments transformed entire hillsides into fluttering white landscapes. In colder or wetter weather, the situation grew considerably more difficult. Clothing hung from rafters, draped near the fire, or occupied every available corner of the cottage until it finally surrendered its moisture. Because indoor spaces were smoky, damp laundry often absorbed the smell of wood fire, giving freshly cleaned garments a rustic campfire-scented finish that no modern boutique has yet tried to reproduce. For most peasants, laundry happened surprisingly rarely, not because they were lazy or indifferent, but because it was simply that much work. A full washing day might occur once every few weeks, or even less often in colder months when water was harder to manage and drying was nearly impossible. Between these major washing days, undergarments were the true heroes of medieval hygiene. And this is a detail modern audiences rarely appreciate. Peasants wore linen shifts, undershirts, and other lightweight garments directly against the skin, beneath their wool outer clothing. These linen layers absorbed sweat, oil, and dirt, keeping the outer garments cleaner and, crucially, more comfortable. Because linen could be washed relatively easily, undergarments were changed and cleaned far more frequently than outer clothes. A single wool tunic might survive months without a proper wash, but the linen shift beneath it saw fresh water regularly. This was medieval hygiene's clever compromise. Keep the layer against the skin clean, and the layer facing the world could pretend everything was fine. You might reasonably wonder how one family managed all this laundry when everyone owned only 2 or 3 garments in the first place. The answer is that they did not manage it comfortably. Laundry day meant that certain items were unavailable while drying, which sometimes required creative wardrobe decisions. If your only good tunic was currently soaking in a river 3 miles away, you wore something older, patched, and probably deeply unfashionable while you waited. Peasants owned very few clothes total, but they knew every single garment intimately. Every stain had a story. Every patch commemorated a moment. Every hem had been repaired, adjusted, and passed down through cousins, siblings, and sometimes entire generations. Clothing was expensive to produce, difficult to replace, and treated with a level of respect that would astonish modern shoppers who casually throw away shirts because they no longer feel inspired by them. This is also why medieval peasants developed such strong feelings about mending. A torn sleeve was not a disaster, it was a Tuesday. Women, and often men, spent long winter evenings repairing clothing beside the hearth, patching worn spots, stitching torn seams, replacing buttons made from bone or wood, and gradually transforming ancient garments into something that could survive another season. A well-mended tunic was a mark of skill, not shame. Modern culture teaches us that visible repairs suggest poverty. Medieval culture understood that visible repairs suggested resourcefulness. Anyone who could keep a garment functional for 10 years, 12 years, sometimes 20 years, was performing a small miracle of practical engineering. Those garments carried their history openly, and frankly, they smelled like their history too. The genuinely fascinating twist in all of this is that medieval peasants were, in some ways, extraordinarily consistent about a certain kind of cleanliness that modern people frequently ignore. Their hands, for example. Because peasants ate almost everything with their fingers, using bread as a spoon and shared trenchers instead of individual plates. Hand-washing before meals was practically a religious ritual. Everyone, from the smallest child to the oldest grandparent, washed their hands before sitting down to eat. Skipping this step was considered rude, unhygienic, and slightly barbaric. Even in the poorest households, a small basin of water waited beside the door for exactly this purpose. Guests were offered water and a cloth as soon as they arrived. Meals began with clean hands, ended with clean hands, and any child who tried to grab bread with muddy fingers received the kind of look that made grown men reconsider their choices. So yes, medieval peasants may have smelled interesting. But their hands, at least during meals, were often cleaner than those of many modern office workers who eat sandwiches directly after touching every doorknob in the building. Teeth are another surprise. Contrary to popular belief, medieval peasants did care about their teeth. They chewed on twigs from certain trees, especially hazel or willow, whose frayed ends worked as primitive toothbrushes. They rinsed their mouths with water, vinegar, or herbal mixtures. They rubbed their gums with cloths and used salt, ash, or crushed herbs to scrub away particles. Their teeth were not white and gleaming, but they were often healthier than you might imagine. Sugar was expensive and rare, meaning cavities were far less common than they became once refined sugar arrived in later centuries. A medieval peasant might smell strongly of livestock and campfire, but their smile was frequently more intact than that of a wealthy noble who ate sweet delicacies every day. There is a certain justice in that detail. The rich rotted their teeth eating imported sugar. The poor kept theirs eating turnips. By now, you might be starting to notice something. The medieval peasant, popularly imagined as a filthy, ignorant creature covered in mud, was actually a remarkably resourceful human being. They understood their environment. They developed practical solutions to enormous challenges. They cleaned what they could, ignored what they could not, and maintained a working system of hygiene that kept entire villages functioning for centuries. Their world simply refused to cooperate with modern standards of sparkling perfection. And in a strange way, that makes their achievements even more impressive. Because staying reasonably clean in a world of mud, smoke, animals, and unheated water is not a failure of civilization. It is a small daily victory that repeated itself, generation after generation, in cottages across an entire continent. If clothing and laundry were the first frontier of medieval hygiene, then the human body itself was the second, and it was considerably more complicated. Because keeping a body clean in the Middle Ages required an understanding of tools, techniques, and traditions that modern people have almost entirely forgotten. There was no shampoo waiting in a plastic bottle. There were no deodorant sticks promising 24 hours of protection. There were no shaving razors sealed inside colourful packaging. And yet, peasants managed. They combed, they trimmed, they scraped, they scrubbed, and they did it all with tools that would look either charming or slightly alarming to anyone raised in a modern bathroom. Let us take a proper look at how a medieval peasant actually maintained their body, because the truth is far more interesting than the cartoon version suggests. Start with hair. Peasant hair, unlike the elaborate styles of the nobility, was usually practical. Long hair for women, shorter hair for men, tied back or covered during work to keep it out of the way. But practical did not mean neglected. Combs were among the most common personal possessions in a medieval household. Archaeologists have found them in astonishing numbers across excavated villages, and they show up in wills, inventories, and household records with remarkable regularity. Combs were made from bone, antler, wood or horn, carved carefully by hand, and often decorated with small designs. They lasted for years, sometimes decades, and they were used constantly, not just for styling, but for something considerably more urgent. Removing lice, because in a world without modern insecticides, hair was a busy neighbourhood. Fleas, lice, and their tiny eggs took up residence with enthusiasm, and combing several times a day was one of the few reliable ways to keep the population under control. Medieval combs were often designed with 2 rows of teeth, one side wider, for detangling, the other side extraordinarily fine, with teeth spaced so closely together that no self-respecting louse could hope to escape. Peasants combed themselves. They combed each other. Mothers combed their children. Grandmothers combed their grandchildren. Evenings around the fire often included this quiet, methodical grooming that was equal parts hygiene and social bonding. Modern people underestimate how much of medieval life was spent simply picking things off other people, but it was a constant occupation. Nobody found it strange. Everyone participated. And the results, while never quite eliminating the tiny passengers entirely, kept them from taking complete command of anyone's scalp. Washing hair itself was less frequent than combing, but it happened. Peasants rinsed their hair with water, occasionally with the same rough soap used for laundry, and sometimes with mixtures of herbs and ash that promised to clean and freshen. Rosemary was believed to strengthen hair, chamomile was thought to brighten it, nettles were used for shine, and vinegar was used to rinse away build-up. Wealthier households might scent hair with lavender or roses. Peasant households used whatever grew nearby. But the practice existed, the effort was made, and hair was not simply left to develop its own personality without supervision. Now, teeth deserve a longer visit, because this is one of the areas where medieval peasants genuinely outperformed the modern imagination. Twigs from hazel, willow, or hawthorn were chewed until their ends softened into rough fibres, creating a primitive but effective toothbrush. Peasants rubbed these twigs against their teeth after meals, scrubbing away food particles with surprising thoroughness. Mouth rinses of water, vinegar, or wine helped remove what the twig could not reach. Some peasants used cloths wrapped around fingers, dipping them in salt, ash, or crushed mint before scrubbing gums and teeth. Sage leaves were chewed to freshen breath. Fennel seeds were kept for the same purpose. Cloves, when available, were treasured almost as much for their breath-freshening power as for their flavour. The result was a mouth that, by medieval standards, was often quite well maintained. As mentioned earlier, sugar was rare and expensive. The average peasant diet was heavy in coarse grains, vegetables, dairy, and occasional meat, meaning cavities were far less common than modern audiences assume. Skeletal remains from medieval cemeteries frequently reveal peasant teeth in impressive condition, worn from tough foods but relatively free of the decay that plagued wealthy nobles who consumed imported sweets. The peasant smile might have been missing a tooth or two from injury, and it might have been stained from wine or smoke, but it was rarely the rotting horror show that popular imagination has invented. Bad breath, of course, was another matter entirely. Onions, garlic, aged cheese, and stronger foods left their signatures long after the meal ended. Peasants accepted this cheerfully. Everyone smelt the same. Nobody complained. Shaving was another daily concern, especially for men. Medieval razors were straight blades made from iron or steel, and they were sharpened obsessively because a dull blade turned shaving from a chore into an injury. Some men shaved themselves. Others visited the village barber, who often doubled as a surgeon, tooth puller, and general dispenser of medical opinion. A visit to the barber might include a haircut, a beard trim, a bloodletting, and possibly the removal of a troublesome tooth, all in a single appointment. Efficiency, medieval style. Fashion in facial hair varied considerably by region and century. Some periods favoured clean-shaven faces, others celebrated impressive beards. Peasants generally followed local traditions, adjusting their whiskers according to what was expected in their village. Women in peasant households did not shave in the modern sense, but they plucked, trimmed and shaped their eyebrows and hairlines according to fashion. Certain periods considered high foreheads elegant, and women plucked their hairlines back significantly to achieve the desired look. Others favoured more natural appearances and left eyebrows in their original condition. Beauty standards in medieval villages were less dramatic than those in noble courts, but they existed. A peasant woman going to a village festival made an effort. She washed her face carefully. She combed her hair until it shone. She wore her cleanest tunic, arranged her hair beneath a fresh linen head covering, and pinched her cheeks to bring out colour. Rouge existed, but was rare among peasants. A pinch of the cheek, however, cost nothing and worked beautifully. Skin care was more practical than glamorous. Peasant hands, faces and necks were constantly exposed to sun, wind, cold and physical labour. Cracked skin, chapped lips and rough patches were the daily reality. Peasants used what nature provided. Animal fats rendered from cooking were rubbed into rough hands to soften them. Beeswax mixed with herbs made simple balms for lips and cuts. Butter served as an emergency moisturiser when nothing better was available. Wealthier women might purchase small pots of scented cream from town markets, but most peasants relied on kitchen ingredients that doubled as skin remedies. Honey was applied to burns and wounds. Cool water helped with sunburn. Oats mixed with water soothed itching. It was folk knowledge passed from mother to daughter, grandmother to granddaughter, generation after generation, and much of it worked remarkably well. Nails were trimmed with small knives, clipped carefully with iron blades kept sharp for the purpose. Long nails were impractical for farm work, and they collected dirt in ways that even medieval peasants found unacceptable. Fingernails were scrubbed with small brushes made from stiff bristles, particularly before meals or before attending church. Peasants may not have owned much, but they generally owned clean fingernails, or at least cleaner fingernails than modern audiences might expect from people who spent their days in fields, stables and workshops. Feet, unfortunately, were another story. Peasant shoes were made of leather, thick, sturdy, and rarely designed for ventilation. In warm weather, feet sweated inside them all day. In wet weather, they filled with water. In muddy weather, they became small biological experiments. Foot problems were common. Blisters, calluses, cracked heels, fungal infections, and various unpleasant conditions plagued peasants throughout their lives. They washed their feet regularly, especially before bed, both for comfort and out of respect for whoever shared their sleeping space. The evening ritual of washing feet in a small basin of cool water was one of the most consistent hygiene practices in medieval peasant life. It removed the day's dirt, soothed aching muscles, and made the difference between sleeping peacefully and lying awake, wondering why your toes felt like they belonged to someone else. Toilets deserve their own honest discussion, because this is where medieval hygiene meets modern imagination in the most awkward way possible. Peasant cottages did not have indoor plumbing. There was no bathroom down the hall. Instead, most families used a simple outdoor pit, dug at a reasonable distance from the cottage, covered with a small wooden seat or plank. This was the latrine, sometimes shared between 2 or 3 neighbouring families. It was practical, it was functional, and it was absolutely miserable in winter. Peasants used whatever was available for wiping. Handfuls of grass, moss, straw or leaves were the most common options. Wealthier households, sometimes used old cloth rags, washed and reused. In some regions, small linen scraps were kept specifically for this purpose. It was not glamorous, it was not comfortable, but it was manageable, and everyone was in the same situation, which somehow made the entire arrangement feel less humiliating. Nighttime brought different challenges. Nobody wanted to walk outside in the dark, cold and rain to use the latrine, so most cottagers kept a chamber pot beside the bed. A simple ceramic or wooden vessel used quietly during the night and emptied in the morning. Emptying it was one of those chores that always seemed to fall to the youngest, least influential member of the household, which is why medieval children often had strong opinions about growing up quickly. Chamber pots were rinsed daily, sometimes with vinegar to help control odour, and their contents were disposed of in the latrine, in the fields as fertiliser, or in whatever unfortunate ditch the family had designated for such purposes. Peasant villages were not sparkling clean, but they were not the open sewers that popular imagination sometimes describes. People made efforts. Waste was managed, however imperfectly. Bathing children was a regular activity, especially for infants, who were washed frequently and swaddled in clean linen. Older children were dunked in rivers, streams or basins according to the season and their level of grimy behaviour. And every peasant child eventually learned the great truth of medieval hygiene. You will never be as clean as your parents want you to be, and they will complain about it until the day you finally leave home. Some traditions, once again, remain beautifully unchanged across centuries. If you truly want to understand medieval peasant hygiene, you cannot simply examine the body. You must also examine the home, because the cottage itself was a living, breathing environment that contributed just as much to a peasant's daily aromatic signature as any unwashed tunic or muddy shoe. And the cottage, dear listener, was a fascinating little world. Small, dim, smoky, crowded, and endlessly practical. Not filthy in the cartoon sense, but certainly not the kind of home that any modern real estate agent could describe with a straight face. Let us step inside together and see what medieval peasant life actually looked like from the inside out. A typical peasant cottage was compact, usually a single room, sometimes two if the family had done rather well, with walls made from wattle and daub. That means woven branches plastered with a mixture of mud, clay, straw and animal dung, which sounds unpleasant until you realise it produced walls that were surprisingly warm, remarkably durable and reasonably weatherproof. The floor was usually packed earth, sometimes covered with straw or rushes for warmth and comfort. The roof was thatched with bundles of straw or reeds, tightly bound and skillfully arranged to shed rain. It was a home built almost entirely from materials that grew nearby, assembled with skills passed down through generations, and maintained with the constant care that any handmade structure demands. Inside, the atmosphere was defined by one thing above all others: smoke, because the average peasant cottage had no chimney. Instead, a central fire pit or hearth burned in the middle of the room, and the smoke rose lazily toward a small opening in the roof, wandering through the rafters on its way out. Some of it escaped, most of it lingered. The interior walls, ceiling beams, and everything else inside the cottage gradually darkened into a rich, sooty black from decades of accumulated smoke. This constant smoky presence had practical benefits. It preserved meat hanging from the rafters. It kept insects from making themselves too comfortable. It repelled certain pests. It even helped waterproof the thatched roof from the inside. But it also meant that everyone who lived inside a peasant cottage smelled faintly of wood smoke every single day of their lives. Their clothes smelled of smoke. Their hair smelled of smoke. Their bedding smelled of smoke. Even their food often carried a subtle smoky flavour. Modern people occasionally pay extra for that kind of authentic smoky aroma at trendy restaurants. Medieval peasants received it free of charge as a permanent lifestyle feature. The floor rushes deserve special attention, because they became one of the most misunderstood elements of medieval household life. Peasants covered their earthen floors with layers of dried rushes, straw, or sweet-smelling herbs like meadowsweet, chamomile or lavender when they could find them. These rushes served multiple purposes. They insulated the floor against cold. They absorbed spills and moisture. They provided a softer surface underfoot. And they released pleasant scents when trodden upon. Fresh rushes were laid down regularly, especially before important gatherings, and older rushes were swept out and replaced. However, and this is the part popular history often exaggerates, the rushes were not always changed as frequently as they should have been. In poorer households or during particularly busy seasons, old rushes might remain in place longer than ideal. Crumbs, dirt and small scraps could accumulate beneath the top layers, creating a rather aromatic bottom layer that no one enjoyed thinking about. Every so often the entire floor covering was stripped away, the earth beneath swept and sometimes freshened with lime or ash, and new rushes laid down. Peasants did this whenever possible. Whether they always achieved the ideal frequency was another matter entirely. Furniture inside the cottage was minimal and practical. A sturdy wooden table dominated the centre of the room, surrounded by benches rather than individual chairs. Chairs were luxuries reserved for the head of the household on special occasions. Everyone else sat on benches, stools, or the floor itself. Beds were simple wooden frames strung with ropes to support mattresses made of sacks stuffed with straw. Wealthier peasants might have mattresses stuffed with wool or feathers, but straw was the standard. And straw mattresses, as mentioned in our earlier discussion, had a habit of hosting entire ecosystems. Fleas, lice, bedbugs, mites, and various unnamed guests found straw mattresses to be excellent lodging. Peasants combated these tiny tenants with regular sunning. On warm, dry days, mattresses were dragged outside, beaten thoroughly, and left in direct sunlight for hours. Sunlight killed many of the smaller pests, and beating dislodged the rest. Fresh straw was added periodically, and old straw was burned or composted. It was a constant war, and peasants never quite won it, but they fought bravely every summer. Sleeping arrangements in a peasant cottage were extraordinarily intimate. An entire family might share one or two beds. Parents in the main bed. Children arranged wherever space allowed. Occasionally grandparents, aunts, uncles and cousins added to the arrangement, depending on family circumstances. Add the family dog, possibly a cat, and yes, sometimes the more valuable livestock during winter, and you begin to understand why medieval peasants were rarely lonely and almost never had the luxury of tossing and turning without disturbing at least 3 other people. Privacy did not exist. Personal space did not exist. Snoring, coughing, sneezing, and every other bodily sound was shared democratically among all sleepers, and yet, in this cramped nightly arrangement, families developed a closeness that modern isolation makes almost impossible to imagine. Everyone knew everyone else intimately. Small illnesses spread quickly. Emotional support arrived immediately. And warmth, especially in winter, was distributed generously across every warm body in the room. Windows were small and few. Glass was expensive, and most peasant cottages had no glass at all. Windows were simple openings in the walls, covered with wooden shutters that could be closed against cold, rain, or darkness, and open to let in light and air. Some peasants stretched thin animal membranes or oiled cloth across the openings to allow diffused light while blocking wind. But mostly, cottages relied on the doorway and the smoke hole for both ventilation and illumination. This meant that indoor light was dim throughout the day and nearly non-existent at night. Peasants used small oil lamps burning animal fat tallow candles when they could afford them, and the firelight from the hearth to illuminate evening activities. Firelight, incidentally, gave everyone inside a warm golden glow that flattered every complexion. Perhaps the medieval peasant looked more attractive by firelight than any of us has ever appeared under fluorescent bulbs. There is a small mercy in that thought. Cooking happened over the central fire, or in some cottages over a small side hearth. Iron pots hung from tripods or chains, cauldrons bubbled with pottage that had been simmering for days, and bread baked in small clay ovens or on hot stones near the fire. The smells of cooking mingled with smoke, straw, animals and human bodies to create the unique cottage atmosphere that peasants knew intimately from birth. Pottage, The everyday peasant stew of vegetables, grains, and whatever meat scraps were available produced smells that could be quite pleasant when the ingredients were fresh and quite alarming when the pot had been reheated too many times. Medieval peasants developed strong opinions about pottage. Fresh pottage was celebrated. Day-old pottage was tolerated. Week-old pottage was consumed only because throwing food away was a luxury nobody could afford. Food storage inside the cottage created its own aromatic contributions. Onions, garlic, dried herbs, and strings of sausages hung from the rafters. Barrels of salted meat, cheeses wrapped in cloth, and jars of preserved fruits and vegetables occupied every available shelf. Beer was often brewed at home, and the smell of fermenting grain was a common household background note. Dairy products, especially soft cheeses, released their distinct fragrances into the general mix. Everything was preserved by salting, smoking, drying, or fermenting, because refrigeration did not exist. Peasants managed food storage with impressive skill, but their homes smelled like everything they had preserved. Sometimes wonderful, sometimes challenging, always distinctive. Animals in the home during winter deserve honest acknowledgement. As mentioned earlier, chickens, goats, pigs and cows occasionally shared the cottage with their human families during the coldest months. This was not universal. Wealthier peasants had separate outbuildings, but in poorer households, the animals stayed inside, occupying a partitioned area at one end of the cottage, providing warmth in exchange for shelter. The arrangement made economic sense. Animals were valuable, and losing them to winter cold was a genuine tragedy. Their body heat helped warm the cottage significantly. But the trade-off was atmospheric. Animals produced smells. Animals produced waste. Animals produced sounds at all hours of the night. Cottages that hosted winter livestock developed a certain rural authenticity that modern noses would find memorable. Peasants swept out animal waste regularly, spread fresh straw, and did their best to maintain some standard of cleanliness. But there was no escaping the fundamental reality. A cow sharing your living room will affect your home's atmosphere. This is true in 1250. This is true in 2025. Physics does not respect century. Cleaning the cottage was a constant task. Sweeping the floor, brushing away cobwebs, beating the rushes, washing wooden surfaces with water and lye, scrubbing pots and dishes with sand or wood ash, wiping down tables, airing bedding, beating rugs, washing linens. The list was endless, and it fell primarily to the women of the household, who managed these tasks between all their other responsibilities of cooking, gardening, tending children, spinning wool, weaving cloth, brewing ale, and helping with fieldwork during busy seasons. A medieval peasant woman worked from before sunrise until after sunset, every day of her life, with almost no break. And her cottage, despite everything, was often cleaner than modern audiences imagine, because she cared, because her mother had cared, because her grandmother had cared, because pride in one's home was a virtue passed down through generations, regardless of how much wealth the family possessed. Special occasions brought extra cleaning efforts. Before religious festivals, weddings, funerals, or the arrival of important guests, the entire cottage received a thorough scrubbing. Fresh rushes on the floor, newly aired bedding, polished pots and dishes, freshly washed linens, herbs scattered across surfaces for pleasant scent. Even the smoke-blackened rafters were sometimes brushed clean. Peasants might not have had much, but what they had was presented at its best whenever occasion demanded. Guests arriving at a peasant home for a wedding celebration would find the cottage looking as pleasant as it possibly could, which was often surprisingly pleasant indeed. The family had worked for days preparing, and every peasant household knew the difference between everyday cleanliness and special occasion cleanliness, just as every modern household knows the difference between the way the kitchen looks on a Tuesday morning and the way it looks when the in-laws are arriving for dinner. If the cottage was the private stage of medieval peasant life, then the village itself was the public one. And the village, dear listener, deserves its own honest examination, Because everything you have heard so far about medieval streets running with unspeakable filth, everything popular culture has taught you about walking through knee-deep sewage while dodging chamber pots emptied from second-story windows, is a mixture of truth, exaggeration, half-truth, and outright invention. The reality was messier than modern life, absolutely, but also more organised than the cartoons suggest. Let us walk together through a typical medieval village and see what daily public life actually looked like, smelled like, and felt like beneath the feet of the people who called it home. Start with the layout. A medieval village was not a random cluster of cottages thrown together without thought. It was carefully organised around several central features: the parish church, usually the largest and most impressive building; the village green, a shared open space used for gatherings, festivals, markets and grazing; a well or two, providing the community's water supply; the lord's manor house or bailiff's residence, watching over the peasants with polite authority. And surrounding these focal points, the peasant cottages arranged along a main road or two, each with its own small garden plot behind it. Beyond the cottages stretched the fields, divided into strips assigned to different families, and beyond the fields lay the woodland, meadow, and wasteland that provided grazing, fuel, and hunting opportunities. Everything had its place, everything had its purpose, and everything unfortunately produced some form of waste that had to go somewhere. Streets in a medieval village were rarely paved. In small villages they were simply packed earth, worn smooth by generations of feet, hooves and cartwheels. In larger villages or market towns, some streets received gravel, cobblestones or wooden planks, especially near the church or marketplace. But most peasant villages relied on the natural surface of the ground, which meant that streets became mud during rain, dust during drought, and something more interesting whenever livestock passed through. Animals were everywhere. Chickens pecked freely between cottages. Pigs wandered wherever they pleased, functioning as the village's unpaid waste management service. Geese honked at strangers. Dogs patrolled their territories. Cows moved to and from pasture twice a day. Sheep passed through on their way to grazing grounds. Every animal contributed something to the road surface, and while the pigs cleaned up quite a lot of what was left behind, they could not manage everything. Peasants did not simply resign themselves to filthy streets. Villages had rules. Manor courts and village councils regularly issued regulations about waste disposal, animal management, and street cleanliness. Records survive from countless English, French, and German villages showing fines imposed on peasants who dumped household waste in the wrong places, allowed their pigs to become genuine nuisances, or failed to maintain the drainage ditches beside their cottages. Every household was expected to keep the area immediately in front of its home reasonably clean. Sweeping was a regular chore. Waste was carried to designated dumping areas, usually pits or middens outside the village proper. Ashes from the hearth were spread on gardens as fertiliser. Kitchen scraps went to the pigs. Human waste, when not deposited in the latrine, was collected for use as fertiliser, an unglamorous but valuable resource that peasants understood perfectly well. The village midden, incidentally, deserves its own moment of respect. This was the communal waste pile, usually located at a discreet distance from the cottages, where broken pottery, old bones, ash, worn-out tools, and other household refuse accumulated over decades. Modern archaeologists absolutely love middens because they reveal enormous amounts about daily peasant life. What families ate, what tools they used, what they discarded, what they treasured. Middens are essentially the diaries of medieval villagers, written in garbage. But at the time, they were simply the practical solution to a practical problem. Waste had to go somewhere. The midden was where it went. And it was managed with more organisation than popular imagination suggests. Water sources deserve serious attention because they were the beating heart of village hygiene. Every village had at least one well, usually located near the centre for equal access, and often several more scattered throughout the community. Wells were treasured, They were protected. They were cleaned regularly. And they were governed by strict rules about who could use them and how. Washing laundry in the drinking well was forbidden almost everywhere. Watering livestock at the drinking well was forbidden. Bathing in the drinking well was absolutely forbidden. Separate water sources served separate purposes. Drinking water came from the deepest, cleanest wells. Washing water came from shallower wells, rain barrels or streams. Livestock drank from ponds or dedicated watering holes. Peasants understood, even without modern germ theory, that mixing these functions led to sickness. They may not have known why, but they knew the consequences, and they organised their water use accordingly. Streams and rivers running through or near villages served multiple purposes. Drinking upstream, washing midstream, livestock and less delicate activities downstream. This arrangement, universally understood, was one of the earliest forms of water management, and it worked surprisingly well when everyone followed the rules. Problems arose when villages further downstream received water that had already served the needs of villages upstream, but even this was managed as best as circumstances allowed. Peasants recognised that clean water was precious, and they treated it accordingly. Modern audiences who casually leave the tap running while brushing their teeth would have been considered dangerously wasteful by any medieval villager. The village well itself became a social centre. Fetching water was a daily task, usually performed by women and children, and the well was where they gathered, chatted, exchanged news, arranged meetings, and organised informal social life. Young, unmarried peasants especially found reasons to visit the well more often than strictly necessary, because the well was where you might accidentally cross paths with someone you had been hoping to see. Modern people meet at coffee shops. Medieval peasants met at wells. The scenery was different. The intentions were remarkably similar. Marketplaces added their own aromatic character to village life. On market days, usually once a week, the village centre transformed into a bustling commercial space. Farmers brought produce. Butchers displayed meat. Bakers sold bread. Cheesemongers offered their varieties. Fishmongers arrived with fresh or salted catches, and their stalls produced smells that lingered long after the market closed. Live animals were bought and sold, adding their contributions to the general atmosphere. Peddlers sold spices, ribbons, needles, and small luxuries brought from distant towns. The market was noisy, crowded, colourful, and thoroughly fragrant in every possible sense. Waste from butchering, spoiled produce, and general market debris was cleaned up afterward, but the smells lingered in the ground itself for days. Peasants accepted this cheerfully. Market day was celebration, opportunity, and social connection. If it smelled strong, that was simply the price of prosperity. Public sanitation, such as it existed, was managed collectively. Ditches ran beside the main roads, carrying rainwater and runoff away from cottages and towards streams or fields. These ditches were maintained regularly, cleared of debris, and treated as important infrastructure. When ditches became blocked, streets flooded, and everyone suffered. So the village community made sure they stayed functional. Bridges across streams were maintained by the community. The village pond was kept clean of the worst debris. Public paths were maintained by whichever families lived along them. It was a distributed system of shared responsibility, and while it was far from perfect, it kept most villages functioning at a level of reasonable order. The parish church deserves its own mention in any discussion of village hygiene, because the church was where peasants gathered most regularly, and its condition mattered enormously. Churches were kept relatively clean, with floors swept, altars maintained, and interiors respected. Before major religious festivals, the church received thorough cleaning. Peasants attended church weekly at minimum, often more frequently, and they made efforts to appear reasonably presentable. A muddy peasant arriving at Sunday Mass would receive disapproving looks. Sunday clothes, kept aside for exactly this purpose, were pulled out and worn with pride. Hair was combed, faces were washed, hands were scrubbed. The church was where peasants stood before God, before the priest, and before their entire community, and nobody wanted to be the person who looked like they had rolled directly out of the pigsty into the pew. Village festivals brought the entire community together in celebrations that lasted from a single day to an entire week, depending on the occasion. May Day, harvest festivals, saints' feast days, weddings and Christmas celebrations transformed the village into a place of music, dancing, feasting, and often quite serious drinking. Preparation for these festivals involved massive cleaning efforts. Streets were swept, cottages were tidied, best clothes were pulled out, bread was baked in enormous quantities, ale flowed freely, and the entire community, temporarily released from the endless demands of daily labour, celebrated together with an enthusiasm that modern people can hardly imagine. Festivals were the highlights of the peasant year, and they were preceded by hygiene efforts that peasants might not have made otherwise. Nothing motivated a good scrubbing quite like the prospect of dancing with the entire village watching. Death also brought the community together, and funerals involved careful rituals of washing and preparation. When a peasant died, family members washed the body carefully, dressed it in clean linens, and prepared it for burial. The church bell tolled to announce the death. Neighbours gathered to pay respects. The priest conducted the funeral mass, and the body was buried in the churchyard, in a plot that might be reused generations later when the bones had returned to earth. Death was treated with reverence, and the physical preparation of the deceased was performed with genuine care. Peasants understood that this final washing was a matter of dignity, love, and religious duty. Even in poverty, even in grief, the community made sure that its dead departed clean. Sickness, however, was the great enemy of village hygiene. When illness swept through a village, quarantine was often improvised as best as possible. Families with sick members might be advised to stay home, neighbours brought food and left it at the door, visitors were discouraged. When plague or other serious diseases arrived, entire villages sometimes sealed themselves off from the outside world, hoping to survive by isolation. Peasants understood contagion instinctively, even if they lacked scientific explanation. They knew that sickness passed from person to person, and they organised their responses accordingly. It was imperfect. It was often too late, but it revealed that medieval peasants were not helpless in the face of disease. They were resourceful, observant, and willing to accept difficult sacrifices for the good of the community. If the village was the shared stage of medieval peasant life, then the fields were the true theatre where the drama played out from sunrise to sunset, and nothing shaped a peasant's daily encounter with dirt, sweat, and the accumulated grime of hard living quite like the endless hours spent working the land. Because agriculture in the Middle Ages was not the romantic pastoral scene painted by later artists. It was brutal, physical, filthy work performed in every kind of weather, using tools that had barely changed in centuries, on land that demanded everything a human body could give, and occasionally a little more. Let us step out of the village together and follow our peasant into the fields, because this is where medieval hygiene met its greatest daily challenge. The peasant workday began before sunrise. In summer, that meant rising at 4 in the morning. In winter, when daylight was scarce and precious, it meant working from the first hint of light until the last. Peasants dressed quickly in whatever clothes they had worn the day before, ate a simple breakfast of bread and ale or perhaps some porridge, and headed out to the fields carrying their tools. There was no morning shower, there was no fresh outfit, there was no gentle transition into the day. Work began, and the body carried whatever accumulated dirt yesterday had left behind. This is a crucial detail modern audiences must understand. Peasants did not wash before working. They washed after working, when the day was done and the fields had extracted their pound of flesh. Washing before dawn would have been considered slightly absurd, because within an hour of starting work, any cleanliness achieved would have been thoroughly undone by dirt, sweat, animal contact, and whatever the day brought. The nature of the work itself determined the character of the filth. Ploughing turned earth into loose soil that clung to everything. Sowing scattered dust and grain particles across skin and clothing. Weeding required hours of bending, kneeling and crawling through fields, pressing hands and knees directly into damp earth. Harvesting demanded swinging scythes and sickles for hours, coating arms and faces with plant sap, dust and countless tiny insects disturbed from their hiding places. Threshing grain, done later in the barn, filled the air with a thick cloud of chaff that settled in hair, ears, nostrils, and every crevice of clothing. Winnowing separated grain from chaff by tossing it into the air, creating even more dust that peasants breathed for hours at a time. By the end of any working day, a peasant was not merely dirty. They were coated in a comprehensive collection of every substance the season happened to offer. Livestock work added its own distinctive contributions. Mucking out stables, byres and pigsties was one of the most consistently unpleasant daily tasks. Peasants shoveled manure into wheelbarrows or baskets, carried it to compost piles or directly to the fields where it served as valuable fertilizer, and returned to lay fresh straw for the animals. This job smelled exactly as you might expect. It stained clothing in ways that no medieval laundry could fully remove. It required strong hands and a stronger stomach. But it also produced one of the most valuable substances in the medieval agricultural economy. Manure was gold to a peasant. It renewed exhausted soil, improved harvests, and allowed the same land to be worked year after year. Peasants did not merely tolerate manure, they treasured it, collected it carefully, and applied it strategically to their fields. Modern squeamishness about such matters would have puzzled them enormously. To a peasant, a well-managed manure pile represented food security for the coming year. Milking cows and goats was a twice-daily ritual that placed peasants in intimate contact with animals whose personal hygiene standards were, shall we say, relaxed. Milkers wiped down udders as best they could, but the process was rarely sanitary by modern standards. Milk was collected into wooden buckets, carried carefully to the dairy or kitchen, and either consumed quickly or turned into butter and cheese within hours. Because refrigeration did not exist, milk had to be processed rapidly before it soured. Butter churning was often a woman's work, done in the cottage using a wooden churn and requiring hours of steady effort. Cheese-making involved curdling milk with rennet, straining it through cloths, pressing the curds, and aging the result. Every stage produced its own smells, spills, and residues that clung to clothing and skin. Shepherds and swineherds had it slightly easier physically, but paid a different price. They spent entire days outdoors in every weather, walking countless miles behind their flocks, sleeping in simple shelters when they wandered far from the village, and coming home smelling powerfully of the animals they tended. Sheep especially left their distinct lanolin-rich scent on anyone who worked with them regularly. It was not entirely unpleasant, being closer to wet wool than anything genuinely offensive, but it was unmistakable. A shepherd could be identified by smell from across a room, and everyone accepted this as simply the natural consequence of the profession. Swineherds, working with pigs, developed their own aromatic signature that lingered even after washing. Hunting and fishing added variety to the peasant work calendar when the local lord permitted such activities. Fishing in streams and ponds returned peasants home smelling of fish, mud, and river water. Cleaning fish inside the cottage filled the space with distinct odours that lingered for days afterward. Hunting for small game like rabbits or birds, when allowed, involved trekking through forests and marshes, returning home with scratches, mud and blood on clothing. Preparing game required skinning, gutting and butchering, activities that peasants performed with practiced efficiency in the small outbuildings behind their cottages. Nothing was wasted. Skins became clothing or were sold, bones became tools or fertilizer, organs became meals or medicines, but every stage of this processing left its mark on the peasant performing it. Woodcutting deserves attention because it was one of the most consistent year-round tasks. Every peasant household needed enormous quantities of firewood for cooking, heating, and every other purpose that required heat. Gathering fuel was constant work, especially as winter approached. Peasants headed into the woodland with axes, saws, and ropes, cut down permitted trees. chopped them into manageable pieces, and hauled them home either on their own backs or by cart. The work produced splinters, cuts, blisters, and calluses. It coated arms and faces with sawdust and bark fragments. It stained clothing with sap that no washing could ever completely remove. But it produced the fuel that kept the family alive through winter, so peasants performed it without complaint. Well, without much complaint. Every peasant complained about woodcutting occasionally, but they still showed up to do it. The seasons dictated the rhythm of dirt as much as the rhythm of work. Spring brought mud in industrial quantities. Fields being ploughed and sown produced enough mud to coat every peasant in the entire village. Spring rains added to the challenge, transforming paths into rivers of sludge and cottages into damp caves. Peasants accepted spring mud as inevitable and simply adjusted their expectations. Nobody was clean in spring. Nobody expected to be. Summer brought different challenges. Dry weather meant dust rather than mud, and endless hours in the sun produced sweat that soaked through every layer of clothing. Harvest season in late summer and early autumn was the most physically demanding period of the entire year. Peasants worked from dawn until dusk, hardly stopping to eat, driven by the urgency of gathering crops before weather could damage them. During harvest, personal hygiene largely disappeared. Everyone was exhausted, everyone was filthy, everyone smelled powerfully, and nobody cared, because everyone was in the same condition and the harvest simply had to be completed. Autumn brought slaughter time, when animals that would not survive the winter were killed and their meat preserved for the coming months. This was a bloody, smelly, exhausting period of intensive butchering work. Pigs were slaughtered, drained of blood, scalded, scraped, gutted, and butchered into every conceivable cut of meat. Blood was collected for blood sausage. Intestines were cleaned for sausage casings. Fat was rendered into lard. Bones were saved for soup or tools. Every part of the animal was used, but the process filled cottages and barns with smells that penetrated everything for weeks. Peasant hands stayed stained with blood for days at a time. Clothing was ruined and had to be scrubbed extensively. But the reward was meat that would sustain the family through winter, so nobody complained. Winter brought its own hygiene difficulties. Water was harder to fetch when wells froze partially, streams iced over, and every fetching trip risked slipping on ice. Fires burned continuously inside cottages, producing more smoke and more soot than any other season. Bodies were bundled in more layers of clothing that were even harder to wash. Baths became rare because heating enough water was a serious undertaking, and the risk of catching chill while wet was genuine. Winter peasants developed a particular seasonal aroma, a rich blend of wood smoke, sweat, wool, and animal presence that lingered until spring finally arrived and made washing more practical again. It was not glamorous, but it was survivable, and peasants had been surviving winter for generations. The end of every working day brought its own small ritual of hygiene. Peasants returned to their cottages, exhausted and filthy, and performed whatever cleaning they could manage before eating and sleeping. Boots came off outside or in the doorway, hands and faces were washed in the basin. Feet were rinsed in cool water, outer garments were shaken out or brushed. And then the family sat down together to eat whatever meal had been prepared, often pottage or bread with cheese, sometimes meat, always accompanied by weak ale or water. The meal was simple but shared, and it was one of the day's genuine pleasures. Afterward, if there was time before sleep, peasants performed small tasks by firelight, mending clothes, sharpening tools, spinning wool, telling stories to children, combing each other's hair for the day's collection of tiny passengers. And then, finally, sleep on straw mattresses shared with family, dogs, and whatever else had claimed a corner, until sunrise arrived and the entire cycle began again. If we truly want to understand medieval peasant hygiene, we cannot avoid one of history's most misunderstood chapters. The Great Plague years, when disease swept across Europe with a fury that reshaped everything, about how people thought about cleanliness, bodies, and the invisible dangers lurking in daily life, because the plague did not merely kill enormous numbers of peasants. It fundamentally changed the way peasants understood themselves and the world around them. And its influence on hygiene, both positive and negative, lasted for centuries afterward. Let us take an honest look at what happened when disease arrived in the medieval village, because this is where medieval hygiene revealed both its greatest weaknesses and its most surprising strengths. Before the Black Death arrived in the middle of the 14th century, medieval Europe already lived with disease as a constant companion. Illness was so common that peasants developed an almost casual relationship with it. Children died from fevers that modern medicine would consider trivial. Adults succumbed to infections from simple cuts. Whole families were lost to diseases whose names have been forgotten. Life expectancy was tragically short by modern standards, though this figure is often misunderstood. It was not that adults typically died young. It was that so many children died in infancy that the average dragged everyone downward statistically. If a peasant survived childhood, they might reasonably expect to reach their 50s or 60s, sometimes even further. But that first vulnerable decade of life claimed victims constantly, and every peasant family had experienced the loss of at least one child, usually several. Peasants understood disease imperfectly but not entirely wrongly. They knew that sickness spread from person to person. They knew that certain conditions seemed to make illness more likely. They knew that clean bodies, clean water, and clean living spaces reduced the frequency of many common ailments. They did not know about germs, of course. Nobody would understand germ theory for another 5 centuries. But they observed patterns, drew practical conclusions, and organised their lives to minimise the dangers they could recognise. Standing water bred sickness, they said, and they were correct without knowing why. Certain foods spoiled dangerously, they observed, and they avoided those foods with impressive consistency. Certain wounds became fatal if not treated promptly, they learned, and they cleaned cuts with vinegar, wine, or salt to prevent infection. Their medical knowledge was folk wisdom accumulated across generations, tested by countless painful experiments, and it saved more lives than modern audiences generally credit. Then came the year 1347, and everything changed. The Black Death arrived from the east, carried along trade routes by fleas riding on rats, spreading with terrifying speed through cities, towns, and villages. Nobody had seen anything like it. Peasants who woke feeling healthy could be dead by evening. Entire families collapsed within days. Villages that had bustled with life became silent tombs within weeks. The horror was not simply the death toll, though that alone was catastrophic beyond imagination. It was the speed, the unpredictability, and the seeming randomness of who survived and who did not. A strong young farmer might die in agony while his elderly grandmother recovered. A devout monk might succumb, while a notorious sinner walked away untouched. The plague respected no boundaries of age, wealth, virtue, or piety. Medieval people responded with everything they had. Churches filled with desperate prayers, processions of penitents wandered the countryside seeking divine mercy. Doctors prescribed remedies that ranged from reasonable to bizarre, and often quite dangerous, and peasants, watching their neighbours and families die, drew their own practical conclusions. They noticed that isolation seemed to help. Villages that sealed themselves off sometimes survived when neighbouring communities collapsed. They noticed that avoiding the sick reduced one's chances of catching the disease. They noticed that certain smells seemed connected to areas where sickness thrived, and they responded by trying every strategy that observation suggested might work. This is where the story becomes surprisingly complex, because the plague years produced conflicting effects on medieval hygiene. Some responses genuinely improved cleanliness practices. Villagers became more aggressive about waste management. Streets were cleaned more thoroughly. Water sources were guarded more carefully. Public health regulations multiplied, and communities that had previously tolerated certain conditions now demanded higher standards. In many ways, the horror of the plague accelerated medieval hygiene into new levels of organisation. but other responses caused real damage. Medical theories of the time held that disease travelled through miasma, the bad air that rose from swamps, corpses, and foul places. According to this theory, opening the pores through bathing might allow disease to enter the body more easily. Some physicians began recommending against frequent bathing, especially in hot water, on the grounds that a closed body was a safer body. This advice, spreading gradually through medieval medical literature, eventually reduced bathing frequency in some communities. Public bathhouses in certain regions declined, closed, or developed reputations for facilitating disease rather than preventing it. The famous medieval reluctance to bathe, which popular history often applies to the entire medieval period, was actually largely a product of these plague-era misunderstandings, and it developed more strongly in the centuries following the Black Death than in the centuries preceding it. Peasants living in 1200 bathed considerably more often than peasants living in 1500, which is not the pattern most modern audiences would expect. The plague returned repeatedly over the following centuries. It struck in waves, sometimes local, sometimes widespread. Every generation experienced at least one significant outbreak, and every generation refined its response. Peasants developed quarantine practices that saved lives. They learned to identify early symptoms and separate the sick from the healthy. They developed rituals for handling the dead safely. They observed that certain herbs seemed to help symptoms, and though most of these remedies had limited actual effect, some genuinely did reduce suffering. Elderberry, for instance, provided real support to weakened immune systems. Willow bark reduced fevers and pain. Garlic possessed genuine antimicrobial properties. Vinegar, used as a cleaning agent, killed many pathogens. Peasants had no scientific understanding of these effects, but they observed the outcomes and passed the knowledge to their children. Other diseases visited medieval villages regularly. Dysentery struck whenever water sources became contaminated, killing especially the young and elderly. Tuberculosis was common, spreading through the close quarters of peasant cottages and causing slow deaths that families dreaded. Leprosy, though less common than popular imagination suggests, appeared periodically and led to the isolation of victims in special communities outside villages. Smallpox arrived in waves, leaving survivors scarred and sometimes blind. Measles, mumps, and various fevers cycled through villages regularly, killing some victims and merely inconveniencing others. Peasants developed elaborate responses to each of these threats, based on generations of accumulated experience. They knew which illnesses were most contagious. They knew which required strict isolation. They knew which could be treated with rest and simple remedies. It was not sophisticated medicine, but it was practical wisdom, and it worked as well as anything available at the time. Skin conditions deserve their own mention, because they were extraordinarily common among peasants, and shaped much of what modern audiences imagine about medieval appearance. Scabies infected almost every peasant population periodically. This mite-borne skin condition caused terrible itching and characteristic rashes that spread quickly through households and villages. Peasants treated it with sulphur, herbal ointments, and vigorous scrubbing, though nothing worked particularly well. Ringworm, actually a fungal infection despite its name, was common in children and required patient application of various remedies. Impetigo, boils, cysts, and various other skin ailments were part of daily life. Peasant skin often bore the marks of these conditions, along with the calluses, sun damage, and general weathering that came from outdoor labour. A medieval peasant's skin told a story, and it was rarely a story of pampered luxury. Wounds and injuries were another constant concern. Peasants cut themselves regularly with the tools of their trade. Sickles slipped, axes glanced, splinters embedded themselves in hands. Livestock kicked, bit, and stepped on unwary handlers. Every peasant carried a collection of scars accumulated across years of work. Infection was the great enemy of even minor wounds, and peasants learned to clean cuts thoroughly with whatever antimicrobial substances they could obtain. Wine, vinegar, honey, and certain herbs all had genuine antimicrobial properties. Peasants applied them without knowing why they worked. but they worked well enough to save many lives that would have otherwise been lost to sepsis. Broken bones were set as skillfully as possible by local healers, often women who had accumulated generational knowledge about setting fractures and binding wounds. The results were sometimes remarkably good and sometimes tragically poor, but the effort was always made. Childbirth was one of the most dangerous events in a peasant woman's life, and it drew together everything the community knew about hygiene, medicine, and care. Midwives almost always experienced older women from the village, attended births with practices refined across generations. They kept their hands as clean as possible, prepared clean linens for the mother and baby, and applied various herbs and techniques to ease the birth and reduce complications. Despite their best efforts, women died in childbirth with heartbreaking frequency. Infections following birth, hemorrhages, complications from difficult deliveries, all claimed lives that modern medicine could easily save. Every peasant family had lost women in childbirth. Every peasant woman knew the risks each pregnancy carried. And yet, life continued, babies were born, and communities grew despite the constant losses. Death itself was managed with remarkable care given the circumstances. When plague or other diseases produced too many bodies for normal burial customs, mass graves became necessary. Peasants handled these grim tasks with religious devotion, ensuring that even in mass burials, prayers were said and proper rites were observed. Bodies were washed when possible, wrapped in linen shrouds, and buried in consecrated ground with whatever ceremony the circumstances allowed. Peasants understood that respectful handling of the dead was both a religious obligation and a practical necessity. Bodies left unburied bred disease, attracted animals, and horrified communities. The care taken with the dead reflected both spiritual belief and practical hygiene, woven together into a single set of practices that served both purposes. Recovery from plague and epidemic changed villages permanently. Populations rebuilt slowly, sometimes taking generations. Land became more available as families died out, giving surviving peasants opportunities their parents had never known. Wages rose because labour became scarcer. Social mobility increased. Some historians argue that the plague, for all its horror, ultimately accelerated the end of feudalism and the beginning of modernity. For the peasants who survived, life carried a new awareness of fragility, a deeper appreciation for daily blessings, and often a fierce determination to live well in whatever time remained. If disease represented the invisible enemy that shaped medieval hygiene from the outside, then food and drink represented the daily choices that shaped it from the inside. Because what a peasant ate, how they prepared it, how they stored it, and how they consumed it revealed enormous amounts about medieval understandings of cleanliness, health, and the mysterious relationship between the body and everything that entered it. And the medieval peasant diet, dear listener, was far more sophisticated than popular imagination suggests. It was also, in ways that will surprise you, considerably healthier than much of what modern people casually consume today. Let us sit down together at the peasant table and see what actually filled those wooden bowls, because this story reveals as much about medieval hygiene as any bath or laundry basin ever could. Start with the foundation of peasant nutrition. Bread was not merely a food in medieval life. It was the food. It was the substance around which every meal was organised, the resource that determined whether a family thrived or starved, and the daily miracle that emerged from ovens in villages across Europe. Peasants baked bread constantly, sometimes daily, sometimes weekly, depending on family size and local customs. The bread itself was heavy, dense and dark by modern standards. It was made from whatever grain the family had available, usually rye, barley, oats or a mixture. With wheat reserved for wealthier households or special occasions, the flour was ground coarsely, often containing small fragments of the millstone itself, which meant that peasant teeth were slowly worn down over decades from chewing bread that contained traces of stone. Archaeologists examining medieval skeletons can identify peasant remains partly by this characteristic toothware. But that dense, dark bread had genuine virtues. It was extraordinarily nutritious. It contained the whole grain, complete with bran and germ, providing fibre, vitamins and minerals in generous quantities. It filled the stomach for hours. And it kept surprisingly well when stored properly, allowing families to bake in larger batches and consume gradually. Peasants ate bread with everything. They dipped it in pottage, they wrapped it around cheese, they soaked it in ale, they used it as a scoop, a plate, and sometimes as a spoon. A peasant who ran out of bread was a peasant in serious trouble. A peasant with abundant bread had achieved a basic form of security that mattered more than any other measure of prosperity. Pottage, the everyday stew, deserves its own respectful examination. This was the second great foundation of peasant nutrition, and it appeared on the table at nearly every meal. Pottage was made by simmering vegetables, grains, herbs, and occasionally meat scraps in a large pot over the hearth fire. The recipe varied by season, by region, and by household wealth. In summer and autumn, when gardens produced abundantly, pottage was rich with cabbage, turnips, onions, leeks, carrots, peas, beans, and whatever else grew nearby. In winter and spring, when fresh produce was scarce, pottage relied on dried peas, beans, preserved vegetables, and grain to provide substance. Herbs added flavour and, according to medieval belief, medicinal benefits. Salt was used when it could be afforded. Meat, when available, was often just a small piece for flavour rather than a main ingredient. What makes pottage genuinely fascinating from a hygiene perspective is how it was maintained. In many peasant households, the pottage pot never stopped cooking. It simmered continuously over the fire, with new ingredients added as old ones were consumed. This constant heating kept the contents relatively safe from spoilage, killing bacteria that might otherwise multiply in stored food. Modern audiences sometimes recoil at the idea of a pot that has been cooking for weeks, but the practice worked well when managed properly. The heat sterilized the ingredients continuously. Fresh vegetables added flavour and nutrition. Old bones and scraps contributed depth. And the peasant family always had something warm and nourishing available, no matter what else the day demanded. It was an early form of the slow cooker, powered by hearth fire and centuries of practical wisdom. Vegetables from the garden were the heart of peasant nutrition. Every cottage had its garden plot, tended primarily by the women of the household. And these gardens produced an impressive variety of food. Cabbages of many varieties grew in nearly every peasant garden, providing both fresh eating and preserved sauerkraut for winter. Onions and leeks appeared everywhere, adding flavour to countless dishes and offering their genuine antimicrobial properties. Garlic was treasured as both food and medicine. Turnips, parsnips, carrots, and various root vegetables provided winter storage crops. Peas and beans, both fresh in season and dried for later, offered essential protein when meat was scarce. Herbs grew in profusion, both culinary and medicinal. Peasants ate more vegetables than most modern audiences realise, and their gardens supplied a diverse, seasonal diet that would satisfy any modern nutritionist. Dairy products played an important role, especially in regions with good pasture land. Milk was consumed fresh when available, but its primary value was in what it became. Butter was churned regularly, salted heavily for preservation, and used in cooking or spread on bread. Cheese came in many varieties, from soft fresh cheeses eaten within days to hard-aged cheeses that lasted months. Whey, the liquid remaining after cheese making, was drunk as a refreshing beverage or used to feed livestock. Cream was skimmed from milk for special dishes. Every part of the dairy process produced something useful, and peasants managed dairy operations with impressive skill. The smells were distinctive, sometimes powerfully so, but the products were nutritionally valuable and provided some of the most reliable food security a peasant family could achieve. Meat was less common than modern audiences often assume. Peasants ate meat when they could, but not daily and not in the quantities that wealthier medieval society enjoyed. Pigs were the most important meat animal for peasants, because pigs converted household scraps into valuable protein and could be raised on very limited resources. When a pig was slaughtered in autumn, the family celebrated. Every part was preserved carefully. Hams were salted and smoked. Sausages were made from every possible scrap. Bacon was cured for months of use. Blood became blood sausage. Feet, ears, snouts and tails all found their way into pots. Fat was rendered into lard for cooking. The pig provided meat throughout the winter and into spring, and its careful preservation was one of the most important hygiene skills a peasant household possessed. Poorly preserved meat killed families. Well-preserved meat sustained them. The difference lay in salt, smoke, careful handling, and generations of accumulated knowledge. Chickens provided eggs regularly and meat occasionally. Peasants understood that a productive hen was worth more alive than dead, and they kept chickens for years, eating only those birds that had stopped laying or were too old to be useful. Eggs were a valuable food source, consumed fresh when possible or preserved in various ways for later use. Geese and ducks appeared in wealthier peasant households, providing both meat and feathers for pillows and bedding. Rabbits were raised in hutches where the local lord permitted such things. Fish, both fresh from streams and preserved through salting or drying, added variety to the diet, especially during the many religious fast days when meat was forbidden. Beverages deserve serious attention because they reveal one of the most important truths about medieval peasant hygiene. Water, as we discussed earlier, was often unreliable. Even from wells, water could carry contamination that peasants could not detect until sickness developed. So peasants drank enormous quantities of what modern people would call weak beer or small ale. This was a lightly fermented beverage made from grain, containing just enough alcohol to kill many harmful microorganisms while providing hydration, calories, and nutrition. Every peasant, from small children to elderly grandparents, drank ale throughout the day. It was not intoxicating in the modern sense. It was more like nutritional water that happened to have a small alcoholic content as a fortunate side effect of its brewing process. Peasant women brewed ale constantly, often selling surplus to neighbours, and skilled ale brewers earned genuine respect in their communities. Wine was less common in northern regions but standard in areas where grapes grew. Cider appeared in apple-growing regions. Mead, made from fermented honey, was reserved for special occasions. But ale was the everyday beverage, consumed at every meal and between meals, and its role in medieval hygiene was enormous. It provided safe hydration when water could not be trusted. It preserved calories in liquid form. It added variety to a diet that could otherwise become monotonous. And it produced a mild social lubrication that made hard lives more bearable. Modern audiences sometimes imagine that medieval peasants were constantly slightly drunk, but this misunderstands the strength of everyday ale. It was weak enough to be safe for children and constant enough to be background rather than intoxication. Eating itself was a communal ritual with its own hygiene practices. Meals were shared, families gathered around the table together, said prayers before eating, and consumed food in a manner that emphasized community rather than individual preference. Trenchers, thick slabs of bread that served as plates, absorbed juices and sauces, and were eaten at the end of the meal or given to the dogs and pigs. Wooden bowls held pottage and were shared among family members. Wooden spoons were used for liquid foods. Fingers were used for everything else, which is why the hand-washing ritual before meals was so important. Everyone ate from common dishes, everyone drank from shared cups, and personal utensils were rare. This shared eating spread illnesses efficiently when someone in the family was sick, but it also strengthened bonds and reinforced the family as a unit that succeeded or failed together. Storage of food required constant attention and skill. Grain had to be kept dry to prevent mould. Meat had to be salted, smoked, or dried thoroughly to prevent spoilage. Vegetables had to be preserved through fermentation, drying, or storage in cool root cellars. Dairy products had to be processed quickly and stored carefully. Every peasant household maintained storage areas with attention to temperature, moisture, and pest control. Mice and rats were constant enemies, treated with cats, traps and vigilance. Insects damaged stored grain and had to be prevented through careful management. Mold ruined food that could have fed families for months. Preventing these losses required expertise passed down through generations, and peasants who managed food storage skillfully were the ones whose families survived the difficult months between harvests. If food and drink shaped medieval peasant hygiene from within, then the intimate rhythms of the human body shaped it in ways that popular history rarely discusses honestly. Because medieval peasants lived inside their bodies with a directness that modern audiences have almost entirely lost. They understood illness, pregnancy, aging and death, not as distant concepts, but as daily companions. And their approaches to intimate hygiene, menstruation, sexuality, childbirth and the care of the elderly reveal a medieval world that was often more practical, more compassionate and more surprisingly organised than modern imagination suggests. Let us step carefully into these deeply personal aspects of peasant life, because they complete our understanding of what medieval hygiene actually meant. Menstruation was, of course, a monthly reality for half the peasant population, and medieval women managed it with a combination of folk knowledge, practical materials, and community support. Modern audiences occasionally believe that medieval women simply bled freely into their clothing, which is both anatomically improbable and historically inaccurate. Peasant women used absorbent materials made from linen rags, moss, wool, or specially prepared cloth pads that could be washed and reused. These materials were kept clean, changed regularly, and stored discreetly. Women wore linen breeches or specially designed cloths during menstruation, arranged to hold absorbent materials in place beneath their skirts. The system was not modern, but it functioned, and it allowed women to continue their daily work without disruption. Older women taught younger women how to manage menstruation, and mothers prepared their daughters carefully as they approached the age of first bleeding. Attitudes toward menstruation varied by region and era, but they were generally more practical than modern imagination suggests. The Church had complicated views, sometimes discouraging menstruating women from certain religious activities. But daily peasant life continued regardless. Women worked, cooked, tended children, and managed households through their monthly cycles, just as they did every other day. There were folk beliefs, some of them quite strange, about the effects of menstrual blood on plants, animals, and various activities. But these beliefs coexisted with the practical reality that menstruating women simply carried on with life. Peasant communities recognised that menstruation was a normal part of female existence and organised around it without excessive drama. Certain herbs were used to ease cramps. Warm compresses helped with pain. Community support from other women made the experience manageable. It was neither celebrated nor deeply shamed. It simply was, and peasants dealt with it as they dealt with everything else, with practical adaptation. Pregnancy and childbirth deserve extended attention because they represented some of the most intense and dangerous experiences in a peasant woman's life. A typical peasant woman might experience 6 or 7 pregnancies across her fertile years, sometimes many more, though not all pregnancies produced surviving children. Infant mortality was tragically high, and every peasant family expected to lose at least 1 or 2 babies to the difficulties of medieval infancy. Pregnancy itself was treated with a mixture of celebration and caution. The community rallied around expectant mothers, offering advice, remedies, and practical help. Older women who had themselves born children provided the primary support network, sharing accumulated wisdom about everything from managing morning sickness to preparing for labour. Nutrition during pregnancy was managed as well as circumstances allowed. Pregnant women were encouraged to eat well when food was available, though poverty often made this difficult. Certain foods were believed to strengthen the growing baby, while others were avoided for fear of harming the pregnancy. Herbal knowledge, passed from generation to generation, provided remedies for the various discomforts of pregnancy: ginger for nausea, raspberry leaf tea for strengthening the womb, chamomile for anxiety. Some of these remedies had genuine effects, Others worked primarily through the powerful influence of belief and community support. Either way, they gave pregnant women something to do, something to hold on to, in a process that was otherwise mysterious and frightening. Childbirth itself took place in the cottage, attended by the local midwife and several experienced women from the community. Men were generally excluded from the birthing room. The midwife brought her knowledge, her prepared herbs, and her calm authority. She had attended dozens or hundreds of births, and she had seen almost every possible complication. She knew which positions helped labour progress. She knew when to intervene and when to let nature proceed. She knew how to turn a baby that was positioned incorrectly, at least sometimes. She knew when to call for the priest to baptize a baby who might not survive its first breath. Her skills were the difference between life and death, and communities treated their midwives with the respect this responsibility deserved. Cleanliness during childbirth was maintained as well as medieval understanding allowed. Clean linens were prepared. The midwife washed her hands. Hot water was kept ready. The room was cleaned and sometimes fumigated with burning herbs believed to purify the air. Modern audiences might imagine that peasant childbirth was universally filthy and dangerous, but medieval midwives understood the value of cleanliness better than most other medical practitioners of their era. Their hands might not have been sterile by modern surgical standards, but they were considerably cleaner than the hands of contemporary university-trained physicians, who often went from dissecting corpses directly to attending patients without washing at all. Peasant women, attended by peasant midwives, sometimes fared better than noble women attended by learned doctors, precisely because their traditional practices emphasized cleanliness that formal medicine had largely forgotten. After delivery, the new mother rested for a period called the lying-in, typically lasting several weeks. During this time, other women of the community brought food, cared for older children, and handled household tasks so the mother could recover and bond with her newborn. This traditional postpartum support system provided both physical recovery and emotional bonding that modern isolated new mothers often lack. The baby was washed carefully, wrapped in linen swaddling cloths, and introduced gradually to the family. Breastfeeding was universal, since infant formula did not exist and peasant families could not afford wet nurses. Mothers nursed their babies for 2 to 3 years, which provided nutrition, immune support, and natural spacing between pregnancies. When a mother could not produce milk, another nursing woman in the community usually stepped in to feed the baby, sharing this most intimate form of nourishment across families. The care of babies and small children was a communal effort. Older siblings looked after younger ones. Grandmothers minded infants while mothers worked. Neighbours watched each other's children informally. Peasant children grew up surrounded by extended family and community, rarely alone, rarely without supervision, though the supervision was often quite loose by modern standards. Small children ran freely through villages, playing games, exploring corners, and occasionally getting into serious trouble. Accidents were common. Falls from lofts, burns from hearth fires, drownings in wells and streams, all claimed young lives regularly. But the community collective attention to children provided a safety net that individual families could not have maintained alone. Personal intimate hygiene between adults was managed with the same practical adaptation that characterized every other aspect of peasant life. Sexuality was treated as a normal part of adult existence, celebrated within marriage and gossiped about outside it. The church had elaborate rules about proper sexual conduct, but peasants developed their own more relaxed practices. Marriages were often arranged, but affection frequently developed within them, and peasant couples found ways to maintain private intimacy despite the crowded conditions of cottage life. Washing before and after intimate contact was standard practice, using basins of water kept ready for that purpose. Herbal preparations were used for various intimate concerns, some effective, some symbolic, but all reflecting a peasant tradition of practical body care. Contraception, in the sense modern audiences would recognise, was limited but not entirely absent. Peasant women knew about herbs that could prevent pregnancy or interrupt very early pregnancies. though the effectiveness of these methods varied enormously. Prolonged breastfeeding provided natural birth spacing. Traditional wisdom about timing intimacy according to the woman's cycle was passed between women, though understanding of fertility was imperfect. Peasant families were larger than modern families, partly because contraception options were limited, but also because children were economic assets who provided labour and eventually cared for ageing parents. Managing family size was a genuine concern for peasant couples, and they navigated it as best they could with the knowledge available. Ageing brought its own hygiene challenges that peasant communities addressed with dignity. Older peasants who could no longer work full days remained integrated in their households, contributing what they could through lighter tasks, childcare, and accumulated wisdom. Grandparents were valued for their memories, their skills, and their practical knowledge. When ageing brought infirmity, families cared for their elderly members as long as possible. Bathing, feeding, and managing the intimate needs of frail relatives fell primarily to daughters and daughters-in-law, though sons participated when necessary. Bedsores, incontinence, and the various indignities of extreme old age were managed with clean linens, gentle handling, and the compassionate patience that grew from generations of experience. Old age was hard, but it was rarely lonely in the way that modern institutional aging has become. Death arrived, when it arrived, with the community present. Peasants who felt their end approaching often died at home, surrounded by family and neighbours, attended by the priest for last rites, comforted by the familiar sounds and smells of the cottage they had known their entire lives. The washing of the body after death was performed with care by family members and neighbours, dressing the deceased in clean linen for burial. This final act of hygiene, this last cleansing before the grave, was performed with tenderness that expressed love and respect. Peasants believed in resurrection, and they wanted their loved ones to depart clean and dignified toward whatever came next. The funeral, the prayers, the burial, and the shared meal afterward all provided the community with rituals that acknowledged loss while continuing life. Death was not hidden away in institutions. It happened in the cottage, in front of family, as part of the natural rhythm of existence. Widows and widowers received community support during their initial grieving period. Practical help arrived in the form of food, assistance with tasks, and emotional companionship. Remarriage was common, especially for younger widowed peasants, because running a household alone was extraordinarily difficult. Widows with young children particularly needed the economic support that a new husband could provide. Widowers with small children needed a new wife's care and management skills. These practical remarriages were arranged with community involvement, and they usually produced functional new families that continued the essential work of survival. If you have followed this journey through medieval peasant hygiene from beginning to end, then you have discovered something rather important. The story of how ordinary people kept themselves clean, healthy, and functioning across the centuries is not the cartoon tale of universal filth that popular imagination has invented. It is a far more human story, filled with practical intelligence, community cooperation, hard-won wisdom, and yes, the occasional stubborn refusal to admit that a wool tunic worn for 3 months might benefit from a good scrubbing. Let us gather everything we have explored together and see what medieval hygiene ultimately reveals about the people who lived it, because the conclusions may surprise you. The first great truth is that medieval peasants were remarkably resourceful. Faced with challenges that would defeat most modern people within days, they developed practical solutions that sustained entire communities across centuries. They fetched water uphill, they chopped firewood constantly. They preserved food without refrigeration. They managed waste without plumbing. They treated diseases without medicine as we understand it. They delivered babies without hospitals. They cared for elderly relatives without institutions. They accomplished all this while working from dawn until dusk in fields that demanded everything their bodies could give. And somehow, in the small hours between exhausting labour and desperately needed sleep, they still found time to comb their hair, wash their hands, sweep their floors, and maintain the basic standards of cleanliness that gave dignity to lives that offered few other luxuries. The second great truth is that medieval hygiene was profoundly communal. Nothing about peasant cleanliness was purely individual. Water was shared from communal wells, laundry was done together at village streams, bathhouses served entire towns, midwives attended births throughout the community, neighbours helped care for the sick, families cleaned each other's hair for the day's tiny visitors, meals were shared from common dishes, even the dead were washed collectively before burial. Peasants understood that survival was a communal effort, and they organised their lives accordingly. Modern audiences, raised in cultures of individual bathrooms, private laundry machines, and isolated bedrooms, sometimes struggle to imagine how deeply medieval hygiene was woven into community relationships. But it was, and this communal dimension made peasant life both more crowded and more supported than modern existence. The third truth is that medieval standards of cleanliness were different from modern standards, but they were not absent. Peasants did not achieve the sparkling perfection that modern hygiene products promise, and their lives contained levels of dirt, sweat, and animal contact that would horrify most contemporary observers. But they also cared deeply about being clean by the standards of their time. They washed hands before meals, they combed their hair regularly, they cleaned their teeth with willow twigs, they swept their cottages, they laundered their linens, they bathed when circumstances allowed. They preserved cleanliness in the areas where they could achieve it, and they made peace with the areas where they could not. This is not the same thing as being filthy. It is being clean within the limits of one's world, which is what every generation of humans has attempted throughout history. The fourth truth is that medieval peasants understood their bodies and environment far better than popular history suggests. They may not have known about germs, but they knew about contagion. They may not have understood biochemistry, but they knew that certain herbs healed and others harmed. They may not have possessed scientific medicine, but they possessed generations of accumulated observation that saved lives regularly. Their knowledge was empirical, tested through countless painful experiments across centuries, and much of it turns out to have been genuinely accurate when modern science finally examined it. Honey really does have antimicrobial properties. Willow bark really does reduce pain and fever. Vinegar really does kill many pathogens. Salt really does preserve meat safely. The peasants who used these substances did not know why they worked, but they knew that they worked, and they applied them with confidence built on generations of results. The fifth truth is that medieval peasant hygiene changed across time and place. Popular imagination often treats the entire medieval period as a single uniform blob of dirt and disease, but the reality was far more nuanced. Peasants living in 1150 bathed more frequently than peasants living in 1450. Peasants living near towns had different hygiene practices than peasants living in remote countryside. Peasants in warm southern regions organised cleanliness differently than peasants in cold northern regions. Peasants living during peaceful, prosperous decades enjoyed higher standards than peasants living during war or famine. There was no single medieval peasant experience. There were countless peasant experiences, shaped by climate, geography, economics, religion, culture, and the countless small variations that made every village slightly different from its neighbours. The sixth truth is that medieval hygiene was closely connected to spiritual belief in ways modern audiences sometimes miss. For peasants, cleanliness was not simply a physical concept, it was a spiritual one. The church taught that outer cleanliness reflected inner purity, that respecting the body meant respecting God's creation, that arriving at Sunday Mass in filthy condition disrespected both community and Creator. Peasants absorbed these teachings and organised their hygiene accordingly. Sunday washing was a religious act as much as a practical one. Baptism began every Christian life with a symbolic cleansing. Last rites prepared the dying for the ultimate purification. Between these bookend rituals, countless smaller acts of washing connected daily life to spiritual meaning. Peasants did not separate physical cleanliness from moral cleanliness in the way modern secular society does. Both flowed from the same source and served the same purpose. The seventh truth is that popular misconceptions about medieval filth have persisted partly because they serve certain modern purposes. When we imagine medieval peasants as universally dirty, ignorant and desperate, we congratulate ourselves on how far we have progressed. Our modern hygiene appears not merely as different, but as superior evolution. This flatters us, but it also obscures uncomfortable questions. Have we really improved so much? Modern people spend hours daily on hygiene rituals that medieval peasants would find bizarre. We shampoo hair that produces no more oil than medieval hair did. We use deodorants that mask smells that hard work would have earned us honestly. We consume antibacterial products so aggressively that we may be weakening our own immune systems. We isolate ourselves from the natural world so thoroughly that we develop allergies and autoimmune conditions that peasants never experienced. Perhaps medieval peasants had something to teach us about the balance between cleanliness and human resilience, if we were humble enough to listen. The eighth truth is that medieval peasants were, above all, human. They loved and quarrelled. They laughed and grieved. They celebrated victories and mourned losses. They cared for their children and worried about their futures. They complained about the weather, gossiped about their neighbours, and grumbled about their landlords. They found small pleasures in shared meals, festival dancing, and quiet moments beside evening fires. They possessed the same range of emotions, the same capacity for love and hate, the same hopes and fears that modern people carry. The fact that they lived without indoor plumbing, without refrigeration, without modern medicine, and without countless other conveniences does not make them fundamentally different from us. It makes them fellow humans navigating existence with the tools available to them, just as we navigate existence with the tools available to us. And 1,000 years from now, our descendants will probably look back at our lives with the same mixture of horror and affection that we sometimes direct at peasant existence. So the next time you hear someone joke about medieval peasants being nothing more than filthy creatures rolling in mud, remember what you have learnt tonight. Remember the combs in every household. Remember the linen undergarments changed regularly. Remember the willow twigs used to clean teeth. Remember the herbs sprinkled on floors for pleasant scent. Remember the shared laundry days at village streams. Remember the elaborate preparations before religious festivals. Remember the midwives whose hands were cleaner than those of contemporary physicians. Remember the meals begun with hand-washing and the funerals concluded with careful body preparation. Remember that peasants worked harder than most modern people can imagine, while still finding time and energy to maintain the basic dignity that comes from personal cleanliness. Remember also that this story is not distant history disconnected from our own lives. Medieval peasants were our ancestors, biological and cultural. Their genes flow in modern veins. Their languages evolved into modern tongues. Their villages became modern towns. Their fields produced the agricultural traditions that still feed us. Their communities developed the social patterns that shape modern life. When you attend a church wedding, you participate in traditions medieval peasants would recognise. When you gather with family for holiday meals, you continue rhythms they established. When you complain about your workload, mock your neighbours gently, or worry about your children, you echo their voices across the centuries. We are not separate from them. We are the continuation of them. The final truth, and perhaps the most important, is that history has a wonderful habit of overturning our assumptions when we look closely enough. What seems obvious about the past often crumbles under careful examination. What seems ridiculous often reveals hidden wisdom. What seems primitive often proves surprisingly sophisticated. Medieval peasant hygiene appeared, from a distance, to be a simple story of universal filth. Up close, it reveals itself as something far more interesting. A story of practical intelligence, communal cooperation, spiritual meaning, empirical knowledge, and stubborn human dignity maintained against remarkable odds. Peasants may have smelled stronger than we do. Their cottages may have been smokier than ours. Their laundry may have been rougher than modern fabrics allow. But they were not the cartoon barbarians of popular imagination. They were resourceful, hard-working, community-minded human beings who managed to keep themselves and their families reasonably clean in a world that offered them none of the tools we now take for granted. And that, dear listener, deserves respect rather than mockery. Because if any of us had been placed in a medieval cottage with a straw mattress, a hearth fire, a wool tunic, and an empty wooden bucket, most of us would have struggled to achieve what medieval peasants achieved routinely. Their cleanliness, imperfect as it was earned through effort and wisdom that modern life has largely forgotten. So the next time someone tells you medieval peasants were absolutely filthy, you can smile knowingly and reply that the truth, as always, is more interesting than the myth. History would nod in agreement, quietly satisfied that at least one more listener has learned to look beyond the cartoons and see the actual human beings who lived, worked, loved, washed, laughed, and eventually rested beneath the same sun that still shines on us today. Thank you for spending this evening with me, exploring one of history's most misunderstood corners. If you enjoyed this journey, please like the video, share it with someone who might appreciate it, and subscribe if you have not already. Let me know in the comments what surprised you most about medieval peasant life, and what topic you would like us to explore together next. Until then, sleep well, stay curious, and remember that history is always more human than we expect it to be.